In the early and mid-1980s, Apple's Macintosh was designed as the opposite of the IBM PC. Where IBM published technical documentation and used off-the-shelf parts, Apple treated the Mac as a sealed appliance, custom hardware tightly bound to its own operating system, with no intent that anyone else would ever build compatible machines. But closed philosophies meet messy realities. Under the hood, early Macs still used the same Motorola 68000 series processors that appeared in all kinds of third-party systems. And the Macintosh operating system, in principle, didn't care who made the motherboard, as long as it saw the right low-level routines in memory when it booted. That memory lived in ROM, a block of read-only chips holding Apple's startup code, quick-draw graphics primitives, and a lot of the classic Mac toolbox. As long as you could supply a compatible ROM image, you could, in theory, wire up your own 68K-based computer that behaved like a real Macintosh. This stood in sharp contrast to the emerging IBM PC clone market. Phoenix and others produced cleanroom BIOSes that legally mimicked IBM's firmware, and a huge ecosystem of compatible hardware quickly followed. IBM's control slipped, and the PC platform became de facto open. Apple watched that story unfold and decided it wanted the opposite outcome for the Mac. Yet, the same economic pressures that drove the PC clone boom, demand for cheaper hardware, regional variations, and niche needs Apple wouldn't serve, existed for Macintosh users too. And that gap created a small but determined underground of engineers and entrepreneurs willing to test how far they could push Apple's control over its ROM and operating system. Later accounts of this era are patchy, and many of the smallest projects left barely any paper trail. But together, they form a shadow history of the Macintosh, one defined by copied ROMs, reverse-engineered chips, and a constant low-level legal threat from Cupertino. At the heart of every unauthorized 68K Macintosh clone was the ROM problem. From the original 128K Mac, through the classic 68K line, the ROM wasn't just a tiny startup stub. It was where Apple stored large chunks of the Macintosh toolbox, graphics routines, sound support, and low-level device drivers. When you turned on a Mac, the processor jumped straight into that ROM and began running Apple's code long before the disk-based system software ever loaded. So, a clone maker effectively had three choices. First, they could obtain genuine Apple ROM chips, either by buying donor Macintosh machines and physically moving the ROM, or by tapping into surplus and service channels. Second, they could copy the ROM contents into EPROMs or other programmable chips, what users would now recognize as a ROM image. Third, they could attempt the expensive and risky path of clean room reverse engineering, recreating compatible routines without directly copying Apple's code. The first and second approaches were straightforward technically, but dangerous legally. Some small outfits reportedly bought discounted or broken Macs, desoldered the ROMs, and built new systems that expected those chips to be plugged into a custom motherboard. Others dumped the ROM over a hardware interface and burned that binary image into their own chips, sometimes even letting end users perform the dump themselves. The reverse engineering route was rarer. It required teams to document how Apple's ROM behaved, down to individual function calls and memory locations, while keeping the engineers who wrote the replacement code isolated from Apple's actual implementation. That kind of discipline was difficult for smaller clone projects to maintain, and historical sources disagree on how fully any pre-PowerPC Mac clone actually achieved a clean room ROM. In practice, most of the unauthorized 68K Macintosh-compatible machines ended up leaning, directly or indirectly, on Apple's own ROM code. The engineering problem was tractable. The legal problem was another matter entirely. By the mid to late 1980s, as the Macintosh Plus and SE spread through universities and design studios, some technically inclined users began to wonder whether they really needed Apple's beige box to run Mac software. In hobbyist circles, hardware hackers experimented with building 68K-based systems that could, with the right ROMs, boot the Macintosh system software. These were often homebrew projects, wire-wrapped boards, backplane systems, or repurposed development hardware. Documentation from this era is fragmentary, but contemporary magazine reports and surviving schematics show one-off machines that borrowed ROMs from donor Macs, then added more RAM, more expansion slots, or unusual form factors. A few small companies tried to turn this impulse into a product. Some sold bare 68K motherboards advertised as Mac-compatible to users who were expected to provide their own legitimately purchased Macintosh and transplant the ROMs. Others quietly shipped boards with ROM sockets sized and wired for Apple chips, implying their intended use without explicitly saying so. Because these projects often operated in legal gray areas and niche markets, precise shipping dates and unit counts are hard to verify. Many were sold as kits or component bundles rather than finished systems, specifically to dodge being labeled as full-blown unauthorized clones. Most of these early efforts never achieved broad distribution. They were constrained by the cost of donor Macs, the risk of Apple's attention, and the difficulty of supporting all the edge cases of the Macintosh ecosystem. But they proved one key point. The Mac's closed hardware model could be bent, if not fully broken, by determined individuals with a soldering iron and access to Apple ROMs. Outside the United States, the story of unauthorized 68K Macintosh clones takes on a more regional and improvised character. In parts of Europe and Asia, import restrictions, high tariffs, or limited official distribution made genuine Macs scarce and expensive. That opened opportunities for local firms to offer substitutes, machines that weren't officially called Macintoshes, but that aimed to run Mac software all the same. Companies like Chordata, best known for PC compatibles, reportedly explored or briefly shipped Macintosh-style systems in certain markets, though surviving documentation is thin, and some claims rely on later recollections rather than original catalogs. Dynamac, active in the late 1980s, produced portable Macintosh-compatible machines by repackaging Mac internals into more luggable forms. Accounts differ over exactly how fully authorized each model was and how consistently Apple tolerated them. Outbound Systems, which we'll examine in more detail later, occupied a middle ground. Its portable Mac-compatible laptops were sold primarily in North America but illustrate a broader global pattern. Companies building hardware Apple itself did not offer, such as early lightweight portables, and leaning on user-supplied ROMs to argue that they were merely extending a customer's existing Mac license. There are scattered references to Macintosh-compatible boards and systems in the Eastern Bloc and parts of East Asia in the late 1980s and very early 1990s, sometimes built in low volume for institutional use. Precise details are hard to confirm, and many of these machines never appeared in Western press coverage. Where evidence exists, such as photos of prototype boards or local advertising, it suggests a familiar pattern: standard 68K hardware, Apple-derived ROMs, and minimal branding to avoid direct confrontation with Apple. What ties these international efforts together is their opportunism. Each emerged where official Macs were too costly, too scarce, or too limited, and each depended, in one way or another, on access to Apple's ROM code without Apple's explicit blessing. As word of Macintosh-compatible hardware circulated, Apple moved quickly to defend what it saw as the integrity of its platform. Unlike IBM, which had watched its PC architecture become an open standard under market pressure and legal challenge, Apple argued that its ROMs and operating system were proprietary works protected by copyright and trade secret law. Copying or redistributing those ROMs, whether as physical chips or as dumped images, was, in Apple's view, straightforward infringement. Throughout the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Apple's legal department sent cease and desist letters to companies advertising Mac-compatible boards and systems, pressured resellers that carried gray market hardware, and, in some cases, filed lawsuits. The details of many smaller cases never reached broad public reporting, but references in trade press and court records show Apple consistently asserting its rights over the ROM contents and the Macintosh name. This legal posture had a chilling effect. Even companies that believed they had crafted clever workarounds by requiring user-supplied ROMs or avoiding Apple trademarks in their marketing operated under a constant threat of litigation. Potential investors and distributors were wary of backing products that might be wiped out by a single court order. Where IBM had been forced by the success of cleanroom BIOS vendors to accept an open clone market, Apple benefited from this more aggressive unified stance. The pool of unauthorized 68K Macintosh clones remained small, scattered, and legally vulnerable. Many projects faded quietly, sometimes after only a handful of units shipped, leaving behind little more than anecdotes among enthusiasts and the occasional reference in old legal correspondence. Because many of these confrontations were settled privately, it's difficult to assemble a complete list of targets or outcomes. But the pattern is clear. Apple treated the ROM not just as firmware, but as a legal moat around its hardware business. Among the various attempts to build Macintosh-compatible hardware without Apple's blessing, Outbound Systems stands out as one of the most visible and technically sophisticated. Founded in the late 1980s and based in Colorado, Outbound set out to build lightweight Macintosh-compatible laptops at a time when Apple's own portable offerings were heavy, expensive, or simply not yet available. Outbound's machines used Motorola 68K processors and custom hardware, but they depended on genuine Apple ROM chips to function as Macs. To manage the ROM problem, Outbound required customers to supply ROMs from an existing Macintosh they already owned, typically by transplanting them from specific donor models. The company argued that it wasn't distributing Apple's code, it was merely providing new hardware for software the user had already licensed. This approach placed Outbound squarely in a legal gray zone, and contemporary commentary suggests that even at the time, there was debate over how solid that defense really was. Technically, Outbound's systems were clever. They integrated features and form factors Apple wasn't offering yet, and for some professionals and institutions, they were the only realistic way to get a truly portable Macintosh-compatible machine. But the business was precarious. Outbound had to track which Apple models provided suitable ROMs, support users through the transplant process, and continually adapt to Apple's evolving hardware and system software. Historical accounts differ on the exact role Apple's legal and licensing policies played in Outbound's decline versus broader market and technical challenges. What's clear is that by the early 1990s, as Apple released its own PowerBooks and updated portables, Outbound's niche shrank. The company eventually disappeared, leaving behind a small but passionate user base and a reputation as the most prominent example of a Mac clone maker that tried to thread the needle between outright piracy and full authorization. Outbound's story illustrates both the ingenuity of third-party engineers and the practical limits of building a business on top of someone else's tightly controlled platform. Looking back, the unauthorized 68K Macintosh clones never produced anything like the explosion of vendors that defined the IBM PC clone era. The reasons are both technical and strategic. On the technical side, the Macintosh architecture placed more of its personality into the ROM than the IBM PC did into its BIOS. Cloning that ROM without copying Apple's code was difficult and expensive, especially for small firms. And without a robust clean room alternative, akin to Phoenix's BIOS for PCs, there was no shared foundation on which dozens of vendors could safely build. Strategically, Apple maintained a much tighter grip. It controlled both hardware and operating system, and it was willing to enforce that control aggressively through legal action. This made potential partners wary. Unlike the PC world, where component makers, BIOS vendors, and Microsoft all had incentives to support an open clone market, the Macintosh ecosystem was dominated by a single company with a clear interest in keeping hardware in-house. The market size also mattered. The installed base of Macs in the 1980s was significantly smaller than that of IBM PCs and compatibles, and the platform was concentrated in specific niches like desktop publishing and education. The potential payoff for a risky Mac clone venture was therefore much lower than for a PC clone startup. These factors help explain why pre-PowerPC Mac clones remained a niche, semi-underground phenomenon rather than a transforming industry force. When Apple finally experimented with an official licensing program in the mid-1990s, it did so in the PowerPC era, under tightly negotiated agreements with a handful of partners. That later, sanctioned clone wave is a separate chapter in Apple's history, but it was shaped by the lessons and the legal precedents of these earlier, unauthorized 68K experiments. The story of unauthorized, pre-PowerPC Macintosh clones is ultimately a story about control and openness in computing. On one side were Apple's engineers and lawyers, determined to maintain a vertically integrated platform where hardware and software moved in lockstep, protected by ROM code and intellectual property law. On the other were small companies and individual hackers who saw the Mac interface and software ecosystem as something that could, and perhaps should, live on different hardware, cheaper boards, lighter laptops, or regionally adapted systems. Because so many of these projects operated in legal gray areas or on the margins of the market, their histories are incomplete. Exact production numbers, release dates, and technical specifics are often reconstructed from surviving machines, scattered documentation, and community memory rather than definitive corporate archives. That uncertainty is itself part of the legacy. This was a world where staying just out of the spotlight was a survival strategy. The tension at the heart of these clone efforts has never fully disappeared. In later decades, as Apple transitioned from 68K to PowerPC, then to Intel and ARM-based Macs, the company continued to use firmware, secure boot chains, and tight OS integration to define where and how macOS can run. The brief, official clone era of the 1990s ended abruptly, and modern attempts to run macOS on non-Apple hardware, such as so-called Hackintosh builds, echo many of the same debates over licenses, reverse engineering, and user rights. Seen in that wider arc, the unauthorized 68K Macintosh clones were an early skirmish in a long-running conflict over what it means to own a computer. Were you buying a complete, closed appliance, or a set of capabilities you might legitimately choose to exercise on other hardware? Apple's answer has remained remarkably consistent. The engineers and entrepreneurs who built those early clones, operating in the shadows of that answer, helped define the boundaries of what was possible and what was permissible on one of the most influential computing platforms of the 20th century.